Good day, everyone. We are the Group 4. Today, we will report about the Chapter 2, which is entitled Trade Theories and Economic Development. Under this chapter, the topics that will be further discussed by our members are the basis for international trade, exchange ratios, trade and gain, factor endowment theory, the competitive advantage of nations, a critical evaluation of trade theories, and economic cooperation. So now, let's start.
Basis of international trade. Whenever a buyer and seller come together, each expect to gain something from the other. The same expectations applies to nation that trade. The base of international trade lies in a diversity of economic resources in different countries. All countries are endowed by nature with same productive facilities. There are differences in climatic conditions and geological deposit as also in the supply of labor and capital. These differences provide to a country an opportunity to specialize in the production of some specific commodity. It is virtually impossible for a country to be completely self-sufficient without incurring undue costs. So therefore, trade becomes necessary an activity, though in some cases, trade doesn't always work to the advantage of the nations involved. Virtually, all governments feel political pressure when they experience trade deficits. Too much emphasis is often placed on the negative effects of trade, even though it is questionable whether such perceived disadvantages are real or imaginary. So why do nations trade? A nation trade because it expects to gain something from its trading partner. One may ask whether trade is like a zero-sum game. The one must lose so that another will gain. The answer is no, because one doesn't mind gaining benefits at someone else's expense. No one wants to engage in transaction that includes a high risk of loss. So therefore, trade is a positive sum game. Both nations must anticipate gain from it. In other words, trade is about mutual. Production possibility curve. Without a trade, a nation would have to produce all commodities by itself in order to satisfy all its needs. The figure 2.1 shows a hypothetical example of a country with a decision concerning the production of two products, the computer and automobile. The graph shows the number of units of computer and automobile the country is able to produce. The PPC curve shows the maximum number of units manufactured when computers and automobiles are produced. Since one product can be substituted for the other within the limit of available resources, the country may elect to specialize or put all its resources into making either computers at point A or automobiles in point B. At point C, product specialization has not been chosen and a specific number of each of the two products will be produced. This curve, when analyzed, provides an explanation of the logic behind international trade. Regardless of whether the opportunity cost is constant or variable, a country must determine the proper mix of any two production and must decide whether it wants to specialize in one of two. Specialization will likely occur if specialization allows the country to improve its prosperity by trading with another nation. Principle of absolute advantage and relative advantage explain how PPC enables a country to determine on what to export and when to import. Principle of absolute advantage. Adam Smith may have been the first scholar to investigate formally the rationale behind foreign trade. In his book, Wealth of Nations, Smith used the principle of absolute advantage as the justification for international trade. According to his principle, a country should export a commodity that can produce at a lower cost than can other nations. For example, a situation in which two nations are producing two products. Table 2.1 provides a hypothetical production figures for the USA and Japan based on the two products, the computers and automobile. On case 1 shows that given certain resources and labor, the USA can produce 20 computers or 10 automobiles. In contrast, Japan is able to produce only half as many computers, 10 for every 20 computers the USA produces. So, this disparity shows that American workers are better to produce computers. So, therefore, the USA has an absolute advantage in computer, but Japan has an absolute advantage for automobiles. Based on this rationale, USA should import automobile from Japan. And for Japan, of course, automobiles would be exported and computers imported. If each country specializes in the product with each has an absolute advantage. Each can use its resources more effectively while improving consumer welfare at the same time. Since the USA would use fewer resources in making computers, it should produce this product for its own consumption. Principle of comparative related advantage. One problem with the principle of absolute advantage is that it fails to explain whether trade will take place if one nation has absolute advantage for all products under consideration. If we look into the table 2.1, USA has absolute advantage for both products, that the only difference between case 1 and case 2 is capable of making 30 automobiles instead of 10 in case 1, resulting in absolute disadvantage for Japan for both. At first glance, it seems that the USA has nothing gained trading with Japan, but David Ricardo, the first economist, fully appreciated relative costs as a basis for trade. That the absolute production costs are irrelevant. More meaningful are relative production costs that determine what trade should take place and what items to export. According to him, one country may be better than another country in producing many products but should only produce what it produces best. For example, Switzerland is the home of banking. Based on the number of high-quality competitors, Germany is the center of engineering industry due to their access to mineral and energy resources. US companies are leaders in high-tech and software sectors. Essentially, it should concentrate on either a product with greatest comparative advantage or a product with the least comparative disadvantages. Conversely, it should import either a product for which it has a greatest comparative disadvantage or one for which it has the least comparative advantage. On case 2, shows how relative advantage varies from product to product. The extent relative advantage may be found by determining the ratio of computers to automobiles. The advantage ratio per computers is 2 to 1 or 20 to 10 in favor of the USA. Also in favor of the USA, but to a lesser extent, is the ratio for automobiles 1.5 to 1 or 30 to 20. These two ratios indicate that the USA possesses a 100% advantage over Japan for computers, but only
Good day, ma'am, and good day, classmates. I am Kayla Marie and Lahum, and I am going to present to you the exchange ratios, trade, and gain. Relative advantage can indicate what a country should export and import. But that analysis cannot explain how exactly a country will gain from trading with a partner. In order to determine the extent of trading gain, an examination of domestic exchange ratio is required. So this table will help us to understand how to use the domestic exchange ratios in determining the extent of trading gain. So for example, in case number 2, Japan's domestic ratio is 1 is to 2 or 10 computers for every 20 automobiles. That means that Japan must give up 2 automobiles to make 1 computer. While, if they were going to export automobiles to USA, Japan has to give up only 1.5 automobiles to USA in order to get 1 computer. Thus, trading essentially enables Japan to get more computers than feasible without trading. The USA domestic exchange ratio is 1 is to 1.5 or 20 computers for every 30 automobiles. So this table 2.1, the incentive for the USA to trade with Japan occurs in the form of a gain from specializing in computer manufacturing and exchanging computers for automobiles from Japan.
The next topic is the factor endowment theory. In this theory, if a country is relatively capital abundant, then it has a comparative advantage in a production of capital-intensive good. But if your country is relatively labor abundant, then your country has a comparative advantage in a production of labor-intensive goods. This statement tells how the factor endowment theory works and what is the purpose of this theory. And if you want to know more about the factor endowment theory, Please keep on watching. We all know that there are 4 different factors of production. These are the labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and the land. And all of these factors contribute significantly to the creation of value within a particular product. And identifying the factors of production is important because different goods requires different factor inputs. Factor inputs is used in the production of goods or services in order to make an economic profit. Varying proportion of these factors embodied in various goods has a great deal of impact on what a country should produce. This table shows incomes, working hours, and table days across major cities. It is not right to analyze labor costs without also considering the quality of that labor. A country may have high labor costs on an absolute basis, yet these costs can be relatively low if the productivity is high. Countries with low wages tend to have a low productivity. Factor endowment theory is also known as Heckscher-Ohlins theory. Elie Heckscher and Bertrand Ohlins are the founders of this theory. So according to them, this theory is used to determine the comparative advantage of a various countries, and also it helps us to predict a country's pattern of trade based on its endowment factors of production. So what is country pattern of trade? Country pattern of trade is the composition of exporting and importing. Based on its country's resources, this theory helps us identify what kind of goods and services your country is going to export and import. This model says the following. A country will export goods that are intensive and its relatively abundant factor, and will import goods that are intensive and its relatively scarce factor. So by given this example, we can understand what is relatively abundant factor and what is relatively scarce factor. Let's say there are 2 countries, A and B, 2 goods, X and Y, and there are 2 factors of production, which are K and K stands for capital and L stands for labor. So let's say these inequalities are true. So what exactly is this inequality saying? Before that, let's try to understand the meaning of these symbols or ratio. K subscript A refers to the total amount of capital endowment of country A. Then L subscript A refers to the total endowment of labor or total amount of labor in country A. And K subscript B and L subscript B refers to the same thing as country A. K subscript A over L subscript A, telling us the capital labor ratio in country A, and it also telling us the amount of capital in country A per worker or unit of labor. And similarly, K subscript B over L subscript B, telling us the total amount of capital per worker. So, if there is more capital in country A relatively to labor, then we say that country A is relatively capital abundant. If the first inequality is correct, then it follows that the second equality, which is on the right side, is true. And in this inequality, it tells us the amount of labor per unit in country A, and similarly the same thing in country B. It shows that in country B, there is more labor per capital than in country A, which means that country B is the labor abundant country. So if one country is capital abundant, the other one is automatically the labor abundant country. So next is the goods X and Y. It says that X is relatively capital intensive goods. X is the more capital intensive good. There are more capital per worker being used to produce X than it is used to produce Y. And if X is the capital intensive good, then Y is automatically the labor intensive good. And by this example, it is obvious that country A will export the capital intensive good and import the labor intensive good. According to the factor endowment theory, the country should always export goods that are intensive in its most abundant factor, and import goods that are intensive in the factor that is not abundant or relatively scarce factor. And finally, country B will export good Y because it is intensive in a country B's most abundant factor. and country B will import the capital-intensive good X. Again, this example explains how country will export goods that are intensive in its relatively abundant factor and will import goods that is intensive in its relatively scarce factor.
Good day, ma'am. Good day, classmate. This is my report, The Competitive Advantage of Nations. Michael Porter wrote a book titled The Competitive Advantage of Nations. Michael Porter's book received a great deal of interest all over the world because in that book he identified the four major determinants of international competitiveness, and these are factor condition, demand condition, related and supporting industries, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. These four determinants interact the form of diamond, which provide the context in which a nation's firm are born and compete. Porter's theory also include two additional variables, and these are chance and government. Chance are the possibilities that can happen to your business. Government, based on the government, the run of your business. Because if the government allowed many business product enter to your country, it can cause rivalry and too much supply of that product. In this table, showed the World Competitiveness Scoreboard. In the larger nation, the number one is USA, and the least is the Venezuela. While the smaller nation, the number one is Finland, and the least is the Jordan. That's all. Thank you.
So for my second topic, I am going to present to you a critical evaluation of trade theories. The validity of trade theories. Several studies have investigated the validity of the classical trade theories. The evidence collected by McDougall shortly after the World War II showed that comparative cost was useful in explaining trade patterns. These positive results were subsequently questioned. The studies conducted by Leon Tiff revealed that the USA actually exports labor-intensive goods and import capital-intensive products. These paradoxical findings are now called the Leon Tiff paradox. Thus, findings are ambiguous, indicating that, in its simplest form, the Heckscher-Ohlin theory is not supported by the evidence. So, what is the Heckscher-Ohlin theory? This theory says that the more different two countries are, the more they stand to gain by trading with each other. So in other words, there is no reason why a country should want to trade with another that is a mirror image of itself. However, developed countries trade more among themselves than with developing countries because a look at world trade casts some doubt on the validity of classical trade theories. So there is a tendency for corporations in developed countries to prefer to form direct investment ties in the other, more stable developed countries while avoiding heavy investment in the fast-growing developing world.
Limitation and suggested refinements. Trade theories provide logical explanation why nation trades with one another. But these theories are limited by their underlying assumptions. One of these assumptions is called World Trade Rules Traditional Model. First rule, trade is bilateral. What is bilateral trade? Bilateral trade is an exchange of goods between two nations promoting trade and investment. These two countries will reduce tariffs, import quotas, export restraints, and other trade barriers to encourage trade and investment. Second rule, trade involves products originating primarily from the exporting country. Products from the exporting countries are locally processed and locally made. Third rule, the exporting country has a comparative advantage. The exporting countries should specialize in a certain product to export. With that, goods are exclusively distinguished for a specific country only. And the fourth rule is the competition focuses primarily on the importing country's market. The competition between importing countries is to choose which exporting countries to trade with. However, today's realities are quite different. That's why there are present trade rules. Rule number one: trade is a multilateral process. What is multilateral trade? Multilateral trade are documents treaties among three or more nations. These agreements reduce tariffs and make it more lot easier for business to import and export. Though negotiation is quite difficult than bilateral trade, but multilateral trade has a big impact in economic growth. Rule number two: trade is often based on products assembled from components that are produced in various countries. Unlike the traditional model, goods are processed not just exporting countries but also processed by others. Best example is Apple's iPhone. The design of the product came from Apple, California and assembled by China. Rule number three: it is not easy to determine a country's comparative advantage, as evidenced by the countries that often export and import the same product. And with that, they are considering the factors of production, exchange rate, inflation, and trade barriers. And lastly, rule number four: competition usually extends beyond the importing country to include the exporting country and third countries. Unlike in traditional model, there is a wide range of selection to whom country or countries can perform a multilateral trade. One limitation of classical trade theories is that the factors of production are assumed to remain constant for each country because of the assumed immobility of such resources between the countries. This assumption is especially true in the case of land can only be accomplished by war or purchase. At the present, however, such means to gain land are less and less likely. As a matter of fact, many countries have laws that prohibit foreigners from owning real estate. A significant difference exists in the degree of mobility between land and capital. In spite of the restriction of the movement of capital imposed by most governments, it is possible for a country to attract foreign capital for investment or for a country to borrow money from foreign banks or international agencies. Therefore, capital is far from being immobile. Example of source of capital: U.S. banks as financial institutions in a capital-rich country provides huge loans for Latin American countries. Yet, at the same time, a favorable U.S. business climate makes it possible for U.S. to attract capital from abroad to help finance its enormous federal deficits. Another example of source of capital is money laundering. Money laundering illustrates the high degree of capital mobility. It is a process to transform proceeds of crime into a usable form of disguise their illegal origins. The illegal profits may be derived from drug and arms trafficking, political corruption, prostitution, and so on. To clean and launder them, criminals moves the proceeds through a variety of transactions and financial vehicles before investing them in financial and related assets. Labor is relatively mobile because people will migrate, legally or not, in search for a better life. Because workers cannot easily immigrate to another country which has better wages and benefits, wages have not been equalized across countries. Conceivably, computer workstations and communications technology could lessen this problem by allowing the portion of the workforce to work for any company in any part of the world. Advances in telecommunications making these workers more accessible than ever. Production. Production factors are now considered more mobile than previously assumed. However, Because of the government efforts to restrict the mobility of factors of production, production costs, and product prices are never completely equalized across countries. Yet, amount of mobility that thus exists serves to narrow the price or cost differentials. In theory, as a country exports its abundant factor, that factor becomes more scarce at home and its price rises. In contrast, as a country imports a scarce factor, it increases the abundance of that factor and its price declines. Therefore, a nation is usually interested in attracting what it lacks, and this practice will affect the distribution of product factors.
So the next topic is economic cooperation. Economic cooperation is when two or more countries work together to develop their economies through trade, financial help, and many more. It also provides a platform to discuss ways to improve development and promote trade and investment opportunities. It is also said here that in order to make the best policy, the policymaker should use the theory of second best, which applies to international trade. The theory of second best suggests that the optimum policy is to have economic cooperation on a smaller scale to reduce the trade barriers, improve trade, and many countries within the same geographic area join together to establish various forms of economic cooperation. The picture below shows a geographic area where countries have an economic cooperation. Under economic cooperation, there are 5 levels of economic integration, and those are free trade area, common market, customs union, economic and monetary union, and last, the political union. Let's go first to free trade area. Free trade area is where there are no tariffs or quotas on products from one country entering another. It means goods and services from free trade areas can be bought and sold across international borders without government tariffs, quotas, subsidies, or prohibitions to restrain their exchange. The example of free trade areas are in the picture below. A free trade area where Philippines is included along with Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or we also known as ASEAN. The first free trade agreement signed by the USA was with Israel in 1985, and more, USA entered into free trade area agreements with Singapore and Chile, Mexico with European Union, and Singapore with Australia and Japan. The second is the Customs Union. Customs Union is an extension of free trade area in the sense that member countries must also agree on a common schedule of tariff rates. It harmonizes trade regulations and to establish common barriers against outsiders. The world's oldest customs union is the Benelux Customs Union, and a more recent example is the one formed between Turkey and European Union, which took effect in 1996. The third is the common market. Common market is a higher and more complex level of economic integration. The countries remove all customs and other restrictions on the movement of the factors of production such as services, raw materials, labor, and capital among the members of the common market, and a common tariff trade with other countries. It also refers to an agreement between countries that allows products, services, and workers to cross borders freely. In 1993, the European Union and European Free Trade Area formed the world's largest and most lucrative common market, the European Economic Area. So the fourth is the Economic and Monetary Union. Let's first define the Economic Union and Monetary Union. So, economic union is an agreement between two or more nations to allow goods, services, money, and workers to move over borders freely. While monetary union is an agreement between two or more states creating a single currency area. It involves the irrevocable fixation of the exchange rates of the national currencies existing before the formation of the monetary union. It also means one money or single currency. The President of European Commission, Jacques Delors, issued a report entitled Economic and Monetary Union in the European Country that defines monetary union as having three basic characteristics. First, total and irreversible convertibility of currencies. Second, complete freedom of capital movements in fully integrated financial markets. And third, irrevocably fixed exchange rates with no fluctuation margins between member currencies, leading ultimately to a single currency. The economic advantages of a single currency include the elimination of currency risk and lower transaction risks. Economic union also have two benefits. First, in terms of efficiency and economic growth, the transactions cost associated with converting one currency to another one eliminated, and the elimination of foreign exchange risk should improve the trade capital mobility. Second, in terms of inflation, the implementation of an economic union is a demonstration of a credible commitment to stable prices. There are also four basic elements of economic union according to Delors Committee. First, a single market within which persons, goods, services, and capital could move freely. Second, a joint competition policy to strengthen market mechanisms. Third, common competition, structural, and regional policies. And last, the fourth, sufficient coordination of macroeconomics policies.
The next one is political union. First, let's define political union. Political union is the transfer of most or all sovereignty from two or more states to form a single state. A political union may be a unitary state, that is, all constituent states cease to have a legal existence and they are subject to the same law. A political union may be federal, in which the new state is given certain responsibilities and remaining powers stay with the previous independent state. Political unions generally have one currency and have no trade barriers between constituent states. A political union is the ultimate type of regional cooperation because it involves both economic and political policy. Did you know that France and Germany is a part of the European Union? With France and Germany leading the way, the European Union has been moving towards social, political, and economic integration. The European Union goal is to form a political union similar to the 50 states of the USA. The European Union's debate over political union involves issues such as having common defense, foreign policies, strengthening the role of EU Parliament, and adopting the EU-wide social policy. Late 1991, the member countries of the European Union have given the European Union authority to act in defense, in foreign, and in social policies. It is doubtful that forms of economic integration and political union can ever become reality. Even if they did, they would not last long because different countries eventually have different goals and inflation rates. More important is that no country would be willing to surrender its sovereignty for economic reasons. The European Union will be the first group of industrial nations to deal with the following. The next topic would be economic and marketing implications. Marketing implications are changes in sales or other results that can be expected from a particular strategy. For example, changes in product design or business processes have marketing implications because it increases customers' use and future purchases of a product under certain circumstances. Marketers must pay attention to the effects of regional economic cooperation because the competitive environment may change drastically over time. As in the case of the European Union, although European Union member countries still maintain their national identities, national borders are no longer trade barriers. Marketers must treat the European Union as a single market rather than as a numerous separate and fragmented markets. They need to rethink their marketing, finance, distribution, and production strategies. For example, even though standard harmonization may include the US firms for the European Union markets, the USA should not influence the process in order to turn the potential barrier into an advantage. Outsider firms can still cope successfully with the single internal market program. Instead of viewing the European Union's development as obstacles, marketers should regard them as both challenges and opportunities. Not unlike coping with a single country's perfectionist measure, the key to competing effectively in the European Union is for an external firm to become an insider. For example, Coca-Cola has terminated some licensing agreements and has consolidated its European bottling operations to cut costs and prices. Using acquisitions to build up its European position, Sara Lee Corporation purchased a Dutch coffee and tea company and took control of Paris-based DIM. In addition, Sara Lee has experimented with the Euro branding strategy by printing several languages on a single package and distributing it to several countries. Economic cooperation may either improve or impede international trade, depending on how the result of the cooperation is viewed. Economic integration encourages trade liberalization internally, while it promotes trade protection externally. The tendency is for a member of an economic group to shift from the most efficient supplier in the world to the lowest cost supplier within that particular economic region.
Question number 1. What is the traditional model of trade rules? Question number 2. What is the importance of identifying the factors of production? Question number 3. What are the 5 levels of economic cooperation? Question number 4. What are the 4 major determinants of international competitiveness? Question number 5. In your own words, why international trade is important?